Hello, everyone. Now, I know that it's hard to keep up on top of what's going on in the Holy Land, but if you want to know more about what's happening here in Israel, I'm Aaron Porras, and this is the Weekly Review. To begin, an attack overnight Monday to Tuesday reported near the Yitzhak junction of the northern West Bank. A Palestinian woman attempting to stab IDF soldiers near the junction before being shot in the leg and subdued. According to the Israeli army, the suspected female terrorist, looking noticeably suspicious from the onset, sitting beside the side of the road before soldiers approached her. And upon the approach, the suspect reportedly revealing her knife and beginning to charge towards the troops. The IDF, for its part, however, opening fire towards her feet, lightly wounding her before her arrest. Army officials confirming that there are no IDF casualties or injuries and that the yet unidentified suspect has been taken to hospital for her wounds. Israel, in the aftermath of the recent conflict in May between Israel and Hamas in Gaza, similar attacks becoming a nearly daily occurrence, though since then the frequency largely subsiding. Cross-border tensions with Israel rising on all sides over the weekend, Israel responding to terror attacks both from Gaza and from Lebanon. Israeli aircraft retaliating Saturday against a string of sporadic but ongoing incendiary and explosive balloon attacks from the Gaza Strip. And in keeping with policy, Israel holding Hamas, as Gaza's ruling authority, responsible for all the violence against Israel. The Air Force reportedly hitting multiple Hamas targets, including an alleged rocket launching site and a Hamas military compound. No injuries have been reported. The Gaza-launched balloons, for their part, sparking at least 4 brush fires on Friday alone, preceding the IDF strikes. Israeli Prime Minister Bennett therefore vowing previously to respond to explosive balloons in the same way as the IDF would to a rocket. Meantime, to the north, overnight tit-for-tats with a suspected Palestinian terror group in Lebanon, escalating into a barrage of rockets aimed at Israel's Galilee region. Israel last week responding to a pair of rockets with airstrikes, the first IDF airstrikes in Lebanon in 15 years, and Lebanese terror group Hezbollah following up on the apparent escalation. The Iran-backed proxy group firing nearly 24 rockets into Israel on Friday, and then the attack followed by a message.
اخترنا منطقة أرضا مفتوحة في منطقة مزارع شبعة. لنوجه رسالة لنكون مشينا درجة. ممكن بعدين نطلع درجة تانية، درجة ثالثة، أعلى، هلا برجع لها بعد شوي. اخترنا المزارع وذهبنا إلى أراضٍ مفتوحة ولم نضرب المواقع العسكرية وإنما محيط المواقع العسكرية. واخترنا المزارع لأنها منطقة عسكرية لا يوجد فيها مدنيون ولا فلاحون ومزارعون، لأنه في أماكن أخرى أراضي مفتوحة بس يحتمل فيها وجود مزارعين وفلاحين. كل شيء حسبناه بدقة.
Speaking on the anniversary of the end of the 2006 Second Israel-Lebanon War, Hezbollah leader Hassan Nasrallah explaining that the rocket attack was designed to tell Israel that we can get serious too, but choose not to, so don't escalate. And whether influenced by Nasrallah or not, Israel seemingly of the same mind. Despite the Iron Dome intercepting most of the barrage, defense officials confirmed that they believe Hezbollah deliberately fired into open and unpopulated areas to rein in a rogue Palestinian faction. And Hezbollah likely has no desire at this time to push things with Israel any further. Then the IDF spokesperson adding that Israel likewise, quote, has no interest in intensifying the conflict or starting a war, but will protect Israeli sovereignty as necessary. An historic meeting seemingly off to a great start. Israeli Foreign Minister Yair Lapid arriving in Morocco and becoming the first top Israeli official to visit the African nation in nearly 20 years. Greeted with fist bumps on the tarmac, Israeli Foreign Minister and alternate Prime Minister Yair Lapid landing in Rabat, Morocco for a host of high-level meetings opposite his counterpart Nasser Bourita and a number of other officials. And Lapid and Bourita's first meeting going way beyond the allotted time, a sign that relations may be warming even faster than expected.
علاقات المملكة المغربية بإسرائيل لا تشبه أي علاقة أخرى.
Then, in welcoming the ties, Bourita adding that Hebrew origins are deeply rooted in Morocco's identity and that he hopes the regional peace can extend to the Palestinians as well.
هناك اليوم حاجة ماسة للبدء في إجراءات لإعادة بناء الثقة بين كل الأطراف خدمة للسلام والاستقرار والازدهار والرخاء في المنطقة. إعادة بناء الثقة والحفاظ على الهدوء والإحجام عن كل ما من شأنه تأجيج التوتر عوامل أساسية لا بد منها لفتح أفق سياسي للنزاع الفلسطيني الإسرائيلي والحفاظ على حل الدولتين.
Lapid, for his part, though, focusing solely on the renewed relations, comparing the move to good parenting, quoting the Quran on peace, and finishing with how, quote, the only wars that have any meaning are those against poverty, ignorance, pandemics, and sickness, end quote.
The agreements that we will signing here today will bring our country's innovation and opportunities for the benefit of our children and their children after them, for years to come.
And not all talk, Lapid and Borita signing 3 framework agreements on interministerial political consultations, cooperation on culture, youth, and sports, and air services between Israel and Morocco. Borita saying that there are at least 10 more agreements in the pipelines. And finally, aside from the new agreements, Lapid also set to officially open the Israeli liaison office in Rabat, and later will head to Casablanca to pray with the Beth El synagogue from the local Jewish community. Lapid's arrival marking the first official top Israeli visit to Morocco since 2003, and the highest-level meeting since the resumption of ties via the Abraham Accords last year. Jerusalem and Rabat cut off ties back in 2000 during the height of the Second Intifada. Now, as tensions between Iran and Israel rising, CIA Director William Joseph Burns landing in Tel Aviv for a 3-day visit. The trip including meetings with various Israeli political and military officials, and reportedly in efforts of fine-tuning coordinations between Jerusalem and D.C., particularly regarding the possible renewal of the 2015 JCPOA nuclear agreement. CIA Director Bill Burns arriving in Israel on Tuesday and scheduled to meet with Prime Minister Naftali Bennett as well as various other defense and intelligence officials. Iran is at the top of Burns' agenda. Both Israel and the West particularly disturbed by recent Iranian attacks on international shipping routes, as well as Tehran's continued progress towards developing nuclear weapons, while JCPOA talks in Vienna stall.
הלא איראן הפילה מטוס אזרחי ותקפה ספינה אזרחית תוך הרג אזרחים ממגוון מדינות ברחבי העולם. המשטר האיראני מפעיל טרור על נתיבי התחבורה הבין-לאומיים. איראן מהווה סכנה ברורה ליציבות האזור, לשלום העולם, ואסור שהעולם ישלים עם זה.
Likewise, U.S. Secretary of State Anthony Blinken renewing promises to hold Iran to account, accusing Tehran of a recent and ongoing pattern of attacks and other provocative behavior, adding that the world cannot allow impunity. Iran, meantime, delaying the resumption of nuclear talks, while enriching uranium far beyond both the limits set in the JCPOA as well as what's necessary for civilian use. And Israeli authorities even claiming that Iran is less than 3 months away from a nuclear bomb, which, if true, confirms U.S. and European concerns that Iran's advancements have rendered re-signing the JCPOA an irrelevant act to begin with. Iran, for its part, however, throwing blame back on the West. Newly inaugurated Iranian President Ibrahim Raisi, a.k.a. the hangman of Tehran, speaking to French President Macron in his first official phone call to a Western leader. In the conversation, Raisi blasting the U.S. for pulling out of the JCPOA and reimposing sanctions in the first place, adding that in any negotiation, quote, the rights of the Iranian nation must be secured and guaranteed, end quote. So with Iran's growing aggressions and hardball, if not stalling, negotiation tactics, CIA Director Burns coordinating with Israeli officials not just on security and a return to the JCPOA if possible, but on alternatives to the JCPOA entirely. Among them, the United States mulling easing sanctions on Tehran in exchange for a freeze on the more provocative parts of their nuclear program. Again, though, if Iran's nuclear development is as advanced as many experts think, no diplomatic solution will likely foil it at this point.
The Delta variant continues to spread, and Israel is seeing a worrisome surge in cases. As today, for the first time, the number of severely ill has reached 400 people. Now, as the numbers continue to rise and the government is struggling to contain the spread, introducing new restrictions in an attempt to avoid a fourth lockdown. Let's take a look at the report.
Prime Minister Naftali Bennett meeting with senior health officials in an emergency session Tuesday night to discuss the surge in coronavirus cases facing Israel. Health officials recommending a number of new restrictions in an attempt to curb the spread. The first, an extension of the Green Pass to include nearly all businesses and venues, from gyms to malls to restaurants. Proof of vaccination or recovery from COVID must be presented to gain admittance, and for those who are not vaccinated, proof of negative coronavirus test results are required. And all this will apply from children aged 3 and above. Officials are recommending limiting the number of people at indoor gatherings to 50 and outdoor gatherings to 100 at private home events, and those not subject to the Green Pass. The cabinet set to meet Wednesday afternoon to approve these measures and decide on a timeline for when they will go into effect. Additionally, the coronavirus cabinet is set to expand the number of rapid testing sites across the country. Currently, there are 150 sites where people can go and get a rapid test, providing results within 15 minutes. Prime Minister Naftali Bennett on Tuesday also visiting the Home Front Command and praising their efforts, saying that 90% of severe cases were people over the age of 50 and asking all citizens over 50 to, quote, be very careful in the coming weeks. While there, he also reiterated his call for Israelis to go and get vaccinated.
כל מי שמעל גיל 60 שעוד לא יצא להתחסן, שיתחסן. מבצע החיסונים הוא הצלחה גדולה. כבר 600,000 מאזרחי ישראל מעל גיל 60 יצאו להתחסן, זה כמעט 50% תוך כמה ימים. מדינת ישראל היא המדינה היחידה בעולם כרגע שמעמידה לרשות המבוגרים שבה אפשרות לחיסון משלים שלישי.
Meanwhile, the health ministry announcing Wednesday morning that some 5,755 new cases of coronavirus were detected Tuesday, slightly lower than Monday when over 6,000 new cases were reported, and the ministry also saying that 87 people are in critical condition and 62 are on ventilators. Israel is currently seeing the number of severely ill patients double every 10 days, and by health experts' estimates, will reach over 800 severely ill, possibly even 1,000 by the beginning of September, unless efforts are successful in containing the virus. So the question remains, will the government's efforts be enough to contain the pandemic, or is Israel headed to a fourth lockdown?
Now, meantime, if you're choosing to fly abroad regardless of the new restrictions, listen up, because we've got some pretty good news. Passengers flying on El Al from New York to Tel Aviv now benefiting from a new pilot program to expedite arrival procedures in Israel, where infections have been on the rise.
I think this process is very good. You know, it helps us get into Israel faster, and it leaves some of the pressure from us when we land. So I think it's very good that they're doing this now here. And you know, they seem to be struggling a little bit with the amount of people, but they're getting good at they're picking up.
Starting Thursday, August 5th, passengers flying El Al between New York and Tel Aviv have had the pleasure of skipping congestion in the airport upon arrival in Israel. And it's all thanks to a new El Al exclusive program to provide PCR tests just before takeoff or even on the plane while en route. El Al officials explaining the rationale.
Instead of holding on in line upon landing, we save the time for the passenger. And second, we decrease the time that the people need to wait until they get the results of the second test.
Israel hoping the new restrictions will slow the spread of COVID-19 by reducing congestion in Tel Aviv's Ben Gurion airport. And if the pilot proves successful, El Al will expand it to more U.S.-Israel routes. The Israel airline also noting, however, that these tests are not a substitute for those required 72 hours before departure. Currently, in order to enter Israel from abroad, one must get a negative COVID test within 72 hours ahead of takeoff and then again after arrival. But passengers must also show proof of vaccination or recovery in the form of a PCR test taken at Ben Gurion Airport, and all this regardless of whether or not travelers must also enter quarantine. Moving on, Lebanon, not the only Israeli neighbor in crisis. Wildfires in Greece spreading rapidly amidst the worst heat wave in the country in over 30 years. And more than 700 firefighters, including reinforcements from nearby Cyprus, France, and Israel, have since arrived to help.
Από το πρωί που η φωτιά ήταν πάνω στο βουνό, μπορούσαν να στείλουν τα πρεσβευτικά να τη σβήσει, την αφήσανε, κατέβηκε κάτω τώρα. Έχει πιάσει οι Θρακομακεδόνες χαμηλά ανατολικά, παίρνει την Ορφέως.
For 6 consecutive days now, 56 active wildfires sweeping across Greece, and thousands have been forced to evacuate as tens of thousands of acres of forests, homes, businesses, and more go up in smoke. Allied country Israel, meanwhile, no stranger to seasonal fires, sending a delegation of some 16 firefighting experts and a large amount of fire-retardant materials. But despite the enduring efforts and week-long temperatures soaring over 40 degrees Celsius or 104 Fahrenheit, victims are largely blaming government authorities.
Angry. I feel angry. I lost my home. I lost my home. I lost my place, my birthday place. Nothing will be the same the next day. I am very angry. Most people here are very angry. The disaster, you can see it, right? It's huge. Our villages are destroyed. There is nothing left from our homes, our properties, nothing. And we were all alone. 3 days now, we're all alone. Nobody helped, no one. People need help. They lost their homes, they lost their jobs. They need help. The government has huge responsibilities. All the governments.
That said, Greek Prime Minister Mitsotakis promising to address the damages as soon as possible.
Να διαβεβαιώσω για ακόμα μια φορά όλους τους πληγέντες ότι η αποκατάστασή τους θα είναι η πρώτη πολιτική μου προτεραιότητα. Όλες οι κάρμενες εκτάσεις θα κριθούν αναδασωτές, θα αλλάξουμε τον τρόπο με τον οποίο δρομολογούμε τα έργα προστασίας, τα αντιπλημμυρικά, τα αντιδιαβατικά.
In other news, a major shakeup in the horizon in Washington. Prime Minister Naftali Bennett announcing his choice for the new Israeli ambassador to the United States. And pending final approval from the cabinet, his choice is none other than the president's brother, retired Brigadier General Michael Herzog. Now, Michael Herzog is no stranger to government. He's the son of Israel's 6th president, Chaim Herzog, and brother to the current Israeli president, Isaac Herzog. And in his own rights, the 69-year-old is also well respected in the IDF after having served for some 4 decades in senior positions, including head of the Strategic Planning Directorate and both military secretary and chief of staff to 4 different ministers of defense. Moreover, Herzog is a veteran negotiator in Israeli-Palestinian peace talks, with his background pertaining to research in the field of Israeli-Middle East relations. And his CV continuing to impress from there, with his seasoned U.S.-Israel ties and current connections to senior members of the Biden administration. So it's no surprise that Herzog's appointment has been described as a slam dunk. And if confirmed, he'll serve as ambassador during both Bennett's and alternate Prime Minister Yair Lapid's terms as Prime Minister. All right, in other news, while Ben & Jerry's is bowing to BDS in efforts to pressure Israeli policymakers, another ice creamery in Israel is taking the higher road. And the prestigious UN prize-winning Buza seen celebrating over the weekend in its classic bridge-building style.
So we have our 9th birthday here in Tel Aviv, and we're giving ice cream for free.
4 hours of free ice cream, complete with a DJ and balloons. A local shop based in Israel's multicultural Western Galilee region, Buza, which means ice cream in Arabic, celebrating 9 years of business in the community. And co-owners Israeli Jew Adam Ziv and Israeli Arab Ala Switat beaming with gratitude over the public's outpouring of support.
זה ממש ממש מרגש לראות את האנשים שמגיעים ומפרגנים, גם מביאים ציורים של ילדים שציירו לכבוד היום הולדת של בוזה, ואנחנו אומרים להם תודה, כאילו ביום הזה אנחנו כל שנה אומרים תודה לאנשים.
But serving up more than just a good cone, Buza long operating with the dream of bringing people together over their high-quality product. Buza even becoming the first Israeli company to win the UN's Flourish Prize for making the world a better place in 2017. And both owners, Ziv and Switat, crediting the Galilee's intertwining cultures for Buza's success.
הפסיפס האנושי שגר פה, והפסיפס האנושי שבאמת האזור והגליליות שנמצאת המיוחד פה באזור גם.
Of course, the ice cream also playing its part.
The most special thing about Buza is that we are making the best ice cream in Israel. Local and fresh ice cream made from the local raw material and ingredients, and served fresh every day.
Now, meanwhile, speaking of the public's support, Buza also getting a leg up from the Western Galilee Now organization, a small business consortium of about 80 companies operating under the JNF USA's Go North initiative, and an anonymous JNF USA donor who's apparently been following Buza's progress for years, footing the bill for this year's birthday party, especially given the emotional roller coaster that this past year and a half has been.
We're very thankful to Jewish National Fund USA that wanted to show the power of ice cream bringing people together. We've gone through a crazy time between Corona and then the riots in the country and also in the Galilee. But ice cream is stronger than anything, and we're celebrating. We're celebrating life in the Galilee.
Now for some good news. Israel's first Olympic gold medalist in rhythmic gymnastics, Linoy Ashram, arriving back in Israel to a beautiful celebration at Ben Gurion Airport. Lifting the gold medal high above her head, Ashram takes a moment giving thanks to her coaches, sponsors, and fans for their support. The gold medalist won the final event over an early favorite, Russia's Dina Averina. But the contest sparked outrage from Russia over what Moscow was claiming was biased ruling. Judges have clarified that the win is legitimate despite Russia's protests. So this makes Ashram's wonderful welcoming home all the more exciting. Her victory making her the third ever Israeli Olympic gold medalist and the very first ever female Israeli gold medalist. Additionally, bringing further pride to Israel and being praised beside Linoy is fellow gymnast Nicole Zelikman, who placed in 7th at the same event.
And that's it for ILTV's Weekly Review. I'm Aaron Porras. See you next week.